When white police officers discover that a black girl is actually a brilliant U.S. attorney in disguise, they make fun of her in court. The most amazing secrets can occasionally be found in the most unlikely places in daily life. A little black girl with bright eyes and a calm demeanor draws everyone's attention in a busy courtroom in downtown Chicago, but not in the way she deserves. The court hardly gives her a second look, the police sneer at her, and the lawyers roll their eyes. They view her as a helpless, weak person who is an easy target. They have no idea that the entire scene has been set up to expose something remarkable. This modest, quiet woman is not your typical citizen. Rather, she is a brilliant U.S. attorney in disguise, poised to upend the entire system. The streets have become shiny ribbons of reflection as the rain continued to pour since morning, hitting the enormous windows of the Edward J. Schwartz Federal Courthouse in downtown Chicago. Headlights sliced through the dense veil of rainfall as automobiles crept through traffic outside. As people brought their fears and hopes into the hallowed halls of justice, the sound of footsteps on polished floors blended with whispered talks within the courthouse. Amidst the customary whirl of attorneys, defendants, and clerks, a small black girl with a battered umbrella stood close to the metal detectors. She was thin, her brown eyes wide and perceptive, darting about the lobby as if she were looking for a friend or an ally in this strange place. The employees of the courthouse hardly gave her a look. In the everyday mob, she was just another face. But the way she silently watched everything and the set of her shoulders suggested a deeper confidence, as if she were treading water calmly in a tumultuous sea. Amara Davis was this person. She appeared to be a recent high school graduate, possibly a reserved college freshman. Her hair was neatly braided back from her face, and she wore a basic navy blue blazer that had seen better days. Nothing that drew attention was flamboyant or boldly printed. But despite her modest clothing, there was a certain fire in her eyes. Letting security inspect her bag, she moved onward. The guard discovered a little notebook, a frayed copy of the Constitution, and one pen, nothing unusual. He nodded curtly and gestured her through. In a matter of seconds, she was almost lost in the flood of people navigating the hallways. Attorneys in sharp suits hurried by with resolute steps, leafing over their legal papers. While defendants nervously looked about, plaintiffs sat waiting for their turn. Nobody paid Amara any particular attention. Despite her youthful appearance, she was no ordinary observer, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Her career would be defined by the case she was here for. Her goal was to apprehend the criminals who were unaware of her presence. High-stakes drama was a hallmark of Courtroom 12B. Although it wasn't the building's largest or most elaborate chamber, it had hosted some of the most well-known cases in Chicago over the previous 10 years. There were rumors that the ghosts of long-gone decisions haunted the terrible silence that pervaded the air. It was not going to be any different today. Amara crept in and sat down at the far side of the public gallery. She watched with her head down, while the clerk for the judge arranged a pile of files at the front. The door's guard ignored her, concentrating instead on the lawyers mingling and exchanging hurried notes. On the opposite end of the aisle, two officers in uniform surveyed the throng with almost arrogant looks. Experienced police officers Officer Jeremy Pierce and Detective Alan Monroe had a history of being accused of misbehavior. They always managed to get out of trouble, someone was always covering for them, or some proof just magically disappeared at the appropriate moment, according to whispers in the corridor. However, as time went on, the black population in some neighborhoods began to file an increasing number of complaints, which alarmed civil rights organizations. Monroe and Pierce were scheduled to testify today in a police brutality prosecution. Tyrone Billups had been taken into custody on suspicion of possessing illicit narcotics. Tyrone said that the police had roughed him up, racialized him, and planted the drugs on him. Even though claims of police misconduct were frequently rejected due to a lack of proof, Tyrone had this time found a lawyer who was prepared to fight back. The two officers, bearing that usual air of complacency, strode up to the front, while Amara observed from a distance. When posed with a challenging subject, Monroe's mustache would twitch and his build would get thick. Pierce was a slimmer man with chilly, piercing eyes who seldom ever spoke in public. However, the two appeared at ease, as though they were aware of the result beforehand. This was merely another day of following the routine for them. Amara took out her notebook and began to scribble quietly. The judge, an older man with silver hair and an even demeanor, caught her attention. She took notice of the court reporter's appearance, the atmosphere of the small crowd, and every nuance of the two officers' conduct. Every observation she made was a piece that might go someplace in the intricate puzzle she was already building in her mind, forming the final image. The opening statements from the defense lawyer and the prosecutor kicked off the proceedings. Tyrone's defense team outlined the alleged misbehavior. False evidence, disproportionate force, racial epithets, and unlawful search. Tyrone was caught red-handed with enough drugs to suggest intent to distribute, according to the state prosecutor, who repeated the officer's version of events. Monroe and Pierce sat with the slack-jawed assurance of men who had done this 100 times before throughout these comments. When Tyrone's defense lawyer spoke fervently about the need to combat structural injustice, Monroe's lips slightly smirked. At one point, Pierce yawned behind his hand. Amara, meantime, studied them from her peaceful seat in the back row. She sensed their contemptuous demeanor. Their seeming indifference to the concept of fairness made her stomach turn. Importantly, though, she maintained an expression of indifference to avoid drawing attention to herself. A murmur of activity filled the room as the judge announced the first recess. Everyone got up, stretched, and moved into the corridor. Amara waited for her turn, observing Monroe and Pierce intently while they spoke with some co-workers. The sound of their laughter filled the hallway. She saw the two men exchange glances in a subtle way, as though they were joking about. Shortly after, she heard bits of discussion as she walked toward a tiny area with vending machines. Monroe said in a low, scornful voice. He muttered, "That girl in the back has been staring at us." Pierce gave a shrug. Most likely just one of those campaigners from the area or something. They always appear, believing they are more knowledgeable about the law than we are. They both laughed. Their laughing had a mocking tone that caused Amara's jaw to clench. Reminding herself to remain composed, she let out a slow breath. She wasn't meant to reveal her secret quite yet. She came to see how these men behaved in the courtroom and to collect evidence. The sting of their derision persisted, though. It strengthened her determination and confirmed the exact reason she was there. They viewed her as helpless and unimportant. They will soon see how mistaken they were. The day went on. They called witnesses. Questions were asked and answered. The legal system stumbled along like the well-rehearsed dance it frequently was. Each side attempted to frame the story. While the state claimed a known troublemaker had a flagrant contempt for the law, Tyrone's side argued on a practice of racist policing. The courthouse corridors turned into a stage for whispered discussions during recess. In order to avoid being noticed by Monroe and Pierce, Amara purposefully walked close to them, always keeping a small group of people or a pillar between them. They told another uniformed officer their account of events, and she listened. Tyrone was discussed as though he were less than human. They made casual comments about his race and discussed areas they believed to be high in crime. Pierce once again glanced in her direction across the corridor. This time, pretending to be a shy spectator, Amara let her eyes fall to the ground. He shook his head, snorted, and resumed his talk. "Kids these days, always getting involved where they don't belong," he murmured. It was evident to her that they firmly believed in their own superiority. They thought that any obstacles would be overcome because the system was on their side. They had been correct for a long time. They had never faced any true accountability. However, Amara had completed her assignments. She had read scores of statements from victims who said these police had framed them or brutalized them, as well as internal affairs records and complaints from outside watchdogs. She was aware that there was more to the story than a single arrest or dubious occurrence. She believed that these two were a part of a wider network that shielded abusive police officers in the 9th Precinct of Chicago. The judge concluded the day's proceedings by announcing that additional witness testimony would be presented before the trial the next morning. Monroe and Pierce strode to the door as others shuffled out. Pierce gave Amara one final look before they departed, his face displaying a mixture of mild curiosity and derision. She did not respond. She just watched them leave. With a quiet resolve driving her every move, she sneaked out of the courthouse by the side entrance and made her way to the bus station in the pouring rain. There wasn't much in Amara's tiny studio apartment, just a small kitchenette and a bed that folded out. It was on the south side and provided her some anonymity. She had purposefully relocated there a month prior in order to become fully integrated into the community and comprehend the attitudes of the locals on law enforcement. Under a single overhead light that night, she laid out her files on a flimsy desk. A patchwork map of corruption was created by photographs, typed notes, and scrawled date lists. Officers Jeremy Pierce and Alan Monroe's faces were in the middle. All around them were references to probable backdoor connections with local gangs, other potential misconduct cases, and lines linking them to other names in the precinct. She had the letter from the United States and her official documents in another binder. She was sent to a special undercover operation by the Department of Justice. She was actually a well-respected assistant U.S. attorney who was well known in the department for her methodical approach and unwavering quest for justice. She was a Harvard Law School graduate. Tucked away in her actual apartment across town was the diploma, complete with all its grandeur. In order to obtain first-hand evidence of the haughty attitudes and possible misconduct that were frequently obscured in official recordings, she had created an undercover role by pretending to be an innocent teenage observer. She was aware that when dishonest policemen thought no one of importance was looking, they often let their guard down. Before her, a maze of wrongdoing sprawled. She had uncovered systemic cover-ups that included witness intimidation, manipulated body cam footage, and fake police reports. The case of Monroe and Pierce involved more than just two renegade police officers. It was a sign that a system was ill. She needed indisputable proof that would stand up in court in order to uncover it and penetrate the blue wall of quiet. She reviewed every document and cross-referenced every testimony till the wee hours of the morning. Every new piece of evidence felt like a stone in an avalanche that was getting bigger. But she had to wait until the appropriate time to reveal who she really was in order to trigger that avalanche. She dreamed of a courthouse trembling beneath the weight of the truth as she eventually dozed off, her face crushed against a partially completed paragraph in her notepad. The following morning, the Chicago sun shone brightly off puddles on the steps of the courthouse, perhaps trying to dispel the darkness caused by the previous day's rain. Amara moved through the crowded morning crowd, her body stooped under a light jacket. Her face was as simple and ordinary as she could manage. She had the same battered notebook and pen with her. The corridors inside were alive with new life. In hurried, strained whispers, lawyers conferred with clients. Clerks in the courtroom hurried with piles of case files. Amara also saw Monroe and Pierce, who appeared to be in charge of the space, resting against a wall and drinking coffee from paper cups at the far end of the hallway. The proceedings today were crucial. Potential eyewitnesses to Tyrone's arrest were among the additional witness testimony anticipated. However, Amara was aware that these statements would be closely examined, particularly if any of the witnesses had a history of misconduct or a personal interest in the case. In actuality, the legal system frequently questioned the credibility of witnesses from underrepresented groups much more harshly than it did police officers. Amara crept back into courtroom 12B and took a seat behind Tyrone's defense lawyer, Marcus Lattimore, a tenacious middle-aged man. From her study, she knew his name. Although he rarely prevailed, Lattimore was well known for taking on difficult cases against the Chicago Police Department. He was persistent, though. Lattimore called a neighbor who said she had witnessed the arrest from her apartment window to start the morning session. The elderly black woman who was the witness, clutching her purse anxiously, described how the officers had taken Tyrone out of his car, flung him to the ground, and seemed to search him without a warrant. She claimed that until more officers showed up much later, she never witnessed them removing any baggies of drugs from his pockets. The prosecution immediately launched an attack, raising concerns about the woman's eyesight, the time of day, her perspective, and her personal prejudices. To cast doubt on her story, every detail was examined. Monroe, meanwhile, sat grinning smugly and looked at the prosecutor every now and again as though to say, "Nice job." Amara recorded every smirk, every scoff, every reaction. She could see how the defense's case was being weighed down by systemic cynicism. She was aware that the true bombshell was still to come, though. Their bluster would crumble when she presented them with her secret armory of proof. Not yet, though. Amara went to the water fountain in the hallway after leaving the courtroom at lunch recess. She sensed that there was someone behind her as she bent over to drink. Over her shoulder, a darkness descended. She straightened up and looked to see Detective Alan Monroe standing with his arms folded a few paces away. He glanced down at her with ill-concealed disdain. He remarked in a rough, low voice, "You've been around a lot. Don't assume I haven't observed." Amara pretended to be perplexed. "The case is all that interests me. All I do in my spare time is study court cases." She spoke in a purposefully hesitant tone, as if she were terrified of his power. A half-smile twisted Monroe's mouth. "Do you believe you are a legal student of some sort?" His tone was sarcastic as he asked. She gave a headshake. "Not precisely. I simply enjoy learning. And I wanted to know." Then Pierce walked up with a Pepsi. He looked at Monroe, then down at Amara, and shrugged. Man, she's not dangerous. Come on. There are other things for us to do. Monroe, however, remained firm. He leaned closer so that only she could hear him, saying, "List, sweetie. Nothing will change no matter what you believe you are doing. This system is well known to us. This system is operated by us. So be kind to yourself. Return home. Look for a more enjoyable pastime." Amara was so furious at his conceit that her heart pounded in her breast, not because she was afraid. She made herself glance down and blink. "I apologize, officer. I had no intention of upsetting anyone." Monroe continued to look at her as if anticipating a different response. He laughed, pivoted on his heel, and left with Pierce when she didn't move. Amara's face stiffened as they turned the corner and vanished. She was more than happy to start a war with him if he wanted one, but he was unaware of how strong her armament really was. Amara went back to her seat and mentally reenacted the encounter. She had to recall her training and maintain her composure. She thought, "Let them undervalue me. Let them make fun of me." Following lunch, a few more witnesses were called, some of whom bolstered the police narrative while others backed Tyrone's account. The tension in the room was evident by mid-afternoon. Tyrone's attorney, Marcus Lattimore, paused for a moment before turning to retrieve some papers from his desk. He gave Amara a quick look. She gave him a slight supportive nod that was hardly perceptible to others, but was sufficient for him to realize that at least one person in the gallery was cheering him on. Lattimore gave a faint nod of recognition in return. As the day's practice came to a finish and the audience started to thin out, Amara slipped up to Lattimore by the defense bench. He was cramming documents into his battered briefcase. Still with that sweet, unsure lilt in her voice, she added quietly, "Mr. Lattimore." His eyes were tired but interested as he gazed up. "Indeed." She started, I've been following this case. Even if I'm merely interested in law, I think you're doing an excellent job here." The corner of his mouth tugged with a tired smile. "It's an uphill battle, thank you. However, I am grateful for the assistance." After hesitating, she went on. "I have discovered some information concerning those officials. How would I get some documents to you that could help establish a pattern of wrongdoing?" His gaze grew piercing. "You are welcome to bring any valid evidence straight to my office. But watch out, you don't want it to go." Amara pressed her lips together and nodded. "I do understand, sir." She handed him a sheet of paper with a phone number that linked to her secure line that she had set ahead of time. After examining it, Lattimore placed it in his breast pocket. With sincerity, he said, "Thank you. We require every available assistance." Amara turned away after giving a slight, courteous smile. She would not yet disclose her true identity. However, each action she made now brought her one step closer to exposing the heinous misuse of power and guaranteeing that justice would eventually be served. Back in her studio that night, Amara meticulously compiled a dossier of preliminary material, anonymized for the time being, just enough to catch Lattimore's attention and bolster his case in court without disclosing the whole extent of her undercover operation. She had to walk a tightrope. Too little information would have little effect, while too much information may undermine the larger sting she had in mind. She arranged important papers. Complaints about internal affairs were never thoroughly examined. Witness accounts from additional victims whose tales uncannily mirrored Tyrone's. Conveniently absent from official documentation, she provided excerpts from the body cam logs. Through a contact in the Department of Justice's Digital Forensics Unit, she was able to retrieve the logs. She waited for Lattimore at a tiny cafe across the street. From the courthouse the following morning. The lines under his eyes were deeper than ever, and his shoulders were bent with fatigue when he arrived. A basic envelope was given to him. With the demeanor of a concerned law enthusiast, she murmured softly, "Take a look at this when you can. It could be useful." He scowled as he studied the envelopes outside. "How did you obtain this?" Amara looked him in the eyes as she considered how much to reveal. "I have references. To put it mildly, I'm not the only person who wants justice to be done." Lattimore gave a slow nod. "I'll check it out. If it's genuine, it may make all the difference." She examined his response, observing the glimmer of fresh optimism beneath his weariness. She warned, "Just use it carefully. I do not wish for it to disappear." He nodded gravely at her. "I get it. I have enough experience in this field to understand how evidence might vanish if it falls into the wrong hands. They then went their separate ways. A glimmer of victory flickered across Amara's breast. A clash that would surprise Monroe and Pierce was put in motion. She still needed to control herself. It was important to be patient. When the trap was completely set and the proof was indisputable, there would be the best possibility for justice. Monroe and Pierce were about to be rudely awakened despite their bravado. Lattimore moved to bring new evidence in court the next day. He mentioned that he had found more documents that could show a pattern of behavior by officers Monroe and Pierce. The prosecution immediately objected, seeking to know the source and citing chain of custody difficulties. But the judge seems interested. He gave both sides a short break to examine these additional materials. Tension swelled throughout the courtroom. Pierce and Monroe gazed at each other with what appeared to be thinly veiled panic. Sitting off to the side, Amara noticed the slight change in their expression, the stiffening of their shoulders, the glint of discomfort in their eyes. She saw the prosecutor confront Lattimore in the hallway during recess. She couldn't hear everything they said, but it was a furious exchange. She had a feeling the prosecution was trying to undermine the original source by demanding to see it. To his credit, Lattimore cited the security of sources in cases of police corruption as justification for not disclosing more information than was required. Heads down in urgent conversation, Monroe and Pierce hovered a few paces distant. Occasionally, they glanced at Amara with suspicion. She acted as though she was unaware of it, concentrating instead on her notebook and writing meaningless lines. On the inside, though, she was preparing for conflict. When fresh evidence started to come to light, she had anticipated that they would become skeptical. The judge said he would examine the documents in his chambers before determining if they may be accepted when the court reconvened. Lattimore gave Amara a quick, appreciative look. She acknowledged with a blink. It felt like the tide could be shifting for the first time in this trial, but there was still a long way to go. She could almost hear the cogs turning in Monroe and Pierce's brains as they tried to figure out who was responsible. They glanced around the tiny gallery. Lattimore may be suspected. They may suspect an activist group or Tyrone's relatives. Amara, though, was sure they wouldn't ever suspect her. They saw her as a helpless, submissive black girl who had no right to interfere in matters beyond her rank. They had no idea that she was planning the entire performance. Rumors were rife in the courts later that night after the judge had taken the documents to review. There were rumors that the proof was fake. Some muttered that it was only the beginning and could bring down half the precinct. Like a ghost, Amara listened to these discussions without participating, gathering every tidbit of gossip and analysis. The following 24 hours were critical, she knew. Monroe and Pierce's credibility would be seriously jeopardized if the judge allowed the additional evidence. They may try to compromise or they may double down. They would be reeling in any case, and that was the most likely moment for them to make a mistake that would reveal even more of their corruption. She requested an off-the-record conversation with an internal affairs contact who had previously been blocked by a trusted colleague at the Department of Justice. The tsunami of new evidence that could soon be made public was hinted to by her. Monroe and Pierce would have less space to move around if she could exert greater pressure from various directions. After the court adjourned for the day, Amara and Lattimore also had a brief meeting. There was additional evidence to support that, she told him gently, but they needed to wait for the judge's ruling. He concurred. If he couldn't properly source the documents, his careless publication might result in mistrials or perhaps disciplinary action. Amara was filled with excitement as she made her way back to her modest studio. Everything was proceeding as planned. But there was a persistent doubt that pulled at the back of her mind. With their strong connections, there was always a chance that these men would somehow undermine the case. Bribery, blackmail, or worse had happened before, but she trusted her own meticulous preparation. She sealed each piece of evidence with her authority as an assistant U.S. attorney and backed it up in other places. In the event that she died, the files would end up in the media. She took out her official ID from a small lockable drawer while seated at her desk. Under the illumination, the golden seal of the Department of Justice glistened. She gave herself a rare smile as she ran her fingertip over her name, Assistant U.S. Attorney Amara Davis. Shortly, she thought. The world will soon find out. Courtroom 12B was tense again the next morning. After examining the evidence, the judge declared that some of it would be included, subject to authenticity certification. He arranged for Monroe and Pierce to answer to these accusations at an evidence hearing the next day. The defense team appeared cautiously hopeful. Tyrone finally dared to display a glimmer of relief after witnessing his arrest turn into a legal nightmare. Lattimore looked more assured than ever, but he was still cautious. Monroe and Pierce's faces had darkened on the other side of the aisle. The easy laughs and nonchalant smirks had vanished. They had switched to crisis management. Presumably giving them advice on how to conduct themselves during the impending hearing, the prosecutor whispered instructions to them. Amara kept a close eye on things from the rear. She could see Pierce drumming his fingertips on the desk and tapping his foot nervously. Monroe looked more composed, but his tenseness was evident from the way his jaw was set. Amara overheard the prosecutor reprimanding them in hushed, frantic tones while she pretended to read some posters that were attached to a bulletin board during a mid-morning break. She didn't hear phrases like "find out who's behind this" and "cover story must be consistent." She learned that there may be an internal source leaking files. Her chest grew constricted. They might take drastic measures to plug an internal leak if they thought it existed. That might jeopardize her entire business. She inhaled deeply and deliberately, reminding herself that she had been careful. Instead of being a part of the precinct's bureaucracy, she had infiltrated as a civilian observer. There would be no paper trail that would trace them back to her, but she needed to be prepared for anything. When cornered, corrupt officers occasionally resorted to unlawful surveillance, threats, or even physical assault. She looked at Pierce's changing eyes and Monroe's wide shoulders. They were dangerous men who had spent too much time in positions of unbridled power. The most dangerous part of the whole process would be the next few days. Still, she walked confidently back into the courtroom. They would never believe that the calm black girl writing in her notebook was the true threat, even though they could suspect a whistleblower in the precinct or someone in their own ranks. And that's exactly why she would be successful. Amara made the decision to review her notes at a tiny cafe a few blocks from the courtroom after the day's proceedings were adjourned. She picked a booth in the corner that looked directly at the door. She quietly put out her papers while a waiter brought her a slice of pie and coffee. When she looked up 15 minutes later, Monroe was standing at the doorway, looking around the room. Her chest pounded with her heart. Perhaps he came in for a bite, but she wondered if he followed me. She didn't raise her head, merely giving him a sidelong glance. After ordering a coffee and grabbing a seat at the counter, Monroe appeared to be staring into space. He sat on the stool for a few moments before turning around and looking at her. His lips formed a gentle smile. Half drunk from his coffee, he got up and walked over to her booth. Amara slipped her folder into her bag and swiftly closed it. Despite her racing thoughts, she forced herself to appear composed. Monroe remarked, "You again," pausing at her table. "You have plenty of spare time, don't you?" She gave a shrug. "I was simply getting a cup of coffee." With his arms folded, he moved into the seat across from her without her invitation. "Anyway, what's your deal?" She swallowed, keeping her complacent demeanor. "No sir, I have no deal. I'm only interested in law, like I mentioned." He lowered his voice and leaned closer. "Stop the nonsense. You don't think I don't see you taking notes like you're a high-profile reporter every day in the rear of the courtroom?" Amara's hands were sticky. She compelled herself to hide it. I apologize. I didn't mean to." With icy eyes, he whispered, "Let me give you a little warning. Even if that lawyer has some fresh and creative evidence, it won't hold up. And you had better figure out where you belong, little daughter." She schooled her features as she took a slow breath. "I have no intention of causing issues." Monroe gave a snort. Indeed, trouble seems to find those who stick their noses in inappropriate places. Then he got up, threw some money on the table to cover his coffee, and walked away. For a while, Amara sat quietly, her heart racing. She was unflappable despite his attempts to scare her. He had, if anything, merely shown how desperate he was. "Your days of being bullied are coming to an end," she said to herself. Amara showed up to the courts early the following morning. She saw Pierce and a few other officers standing close to the entrance as she ascended the stairs. They gave her a quick glance before acting as though they were deep in conversation. She could feel the tension between them, the way they glanced at each other. After passing through security, she headed to a peaceful area of the lobby and took out her phone to see if there had been any developments. Her DOJ contact's text message appeared on the screen. "They are searching for a whistleblower, so proceed with caution." Multiple leads are suspected, according to reports. They may act carelessly. Her belly rumbled. She was aware that it was dangerous, but she had already gone too far to go back. She was present to see the crucial evidentiary hearing, when Monroe and Pierce would have to defend themselves once Lattimore formally presented the new evidence. She slid into her normal seat in courtroom 12B. She saw Monroe and Pierce already in the front, chatting in hushed tones with their lawyer. The bailiff called for silence as the judge entered. Lattimore stood up solemnly and started outlining the document's contents. The tension in the room increased as each piece of evidence was presented. Some of it highlighted discrepancies in police reports and was specifically related to Tyrone's case. Other sections were more general, pointing to a practice of discriminatory law enforcement. As Lattimore related accounts of other people who said the officers had fabricated evidence or used excessive force, Monroe and Pierce were visibly angry. The prosecutor frequently raised objections, claiming that Tyrone's particular arrest had nothing to do with these accusations. However, the judge rejected some of these arguments, indicating that the officer's credibility would be impacted if a pattern of misbehavior was established. Amara observed all of the emotions that flashed across Monroe's and Pierce's faces. Fear, defensiveness, and anger. They found themselves in a corner. They were unable to ignore the charges for the first time. These texts were very thorough and supported by numerous sources. The judge declared at the end of the hearing that he would determine whether parts of the evidence would be admitted during the trial. The ensuing recess was a whirlpool of feelings. Onlookers muttered eagerly, reporters hurried near to get quotes, and the two officers bounded out of the courtroom like thunderclouds. Monroe sent her a scowl full of hate as they walked past Amara. It was like a shock to her, but she fixed him with a silent determination. Amara stayed in the courthouse library to conduct some more study after the judge adjourned for the day that afternoon. For the last confrontation, when she planned to disclose who she really was, she wanted to make sure all of her angles were covered. The sky outside had turned a deep purple by the time she left. The hum of flickering fluorescent lights reverberated off the concrete walls of the courtroom parking garage, which was strangely quiet. Her footsteps reverberated as she crossed the empty area. She felt a chill creep up her back. She sensed footsteps behind her all of a sudden. She looked over her shoulder and accelerated. Pierce and Monroe appeared behind a column. Her heart pounded. "Are you working late, my love?" Monroe's voice reverberated ominously. Amara turned, her face calm but her heart racing. "Maybe I was just collecting more evidence." Pierce gave a hiss. "Really, who are you?" She took a swallow. "I am nothing. I just..." Monroe stepped forward, his hands tensed. "Don't tell us lies. We are aware that you are giving us Lattimore dirt. Please stop." Amara's thoughts were racing. She needed to continue the act for a little while longer. "I have no idea what you're discussing." Pierce gave a smirk. "Stop the harmless routine. We have already spoken with a few people. You are not affiliated with any local nonprofits, nor are you listed on the official list of law students. For whom are you employed?" Her heart pounded. It might be risky if they attempted to hurt her here. However, she was also aware of something they were not. Audio was being recorded by a tiny pin tucked under her jacket and sent to a secure server. She strained to speak with a tremble. "All I want is justice." Monroe grabbed her arm and rushed forward. "Fairness? Do you believe you understand justice? Let me explain. We say that justice is what it is." She looked him in the eye despite flinching at his hold. Pierce hovered behind him, looking around to make sure there were no onlookers. Amara's voice trembled purposefully. "I can't be harmed." "There will be inquiries," Monroe grinned. "We promise not to harm you, my love. We only want you to know that your life will become very challenging if you continue to mistreat us." Playing the part of a scared lamb, she staggered back once they let her go. But inside her recording device, she was capturing every ounce of venomous threats. "Now leave," Monroe snarled. "And you'll regret it if you ever appear in that courtroom again." She turned and ran to the door without saying anything. She dared not turn around. However, she experienced a wave of bitter satisfaction as she hurried out of the parking garage and into the chilly Chicago night. They had just further implicated themselves. Amara made sure the audio from her covert recording equipment was backed up to several safe places that evening. She again listened to the conversation, recording each threat and confirming its accuracy. Opening a criminal inquiry into witness intimidation was more than sufficient. She still wanted the ideal opportunity to make the announcement, somewhere prominent where it would have the greatest possible impact. To prevent any possibility of wiretaps on her own devices, she called her DOJ contact from a payphone and scheduled a meeting for the next morning. They made plans to meet at a public library, where they mingled with the other users. The audio files were on a USB that she handed over. Robert Park, her contact and an experienced detective, gave her a somber nod. "It's serious," said Park. "They are intimidated by you. We could file a federal case if we combine it with the other evidence." Amara's lips were pursed. "My goal is to drop the hammer all at once."
No parstelfis.
"I want everything prepared. We'll use the audio and I'll testify under oath about all I've seen once we make my identity public. We cannot allow them to evade detection or delete evidence." Park nodded after giving her remarks some thought. "I can work with the U.S., but we'll need a strict schedule. Chicago Attorney's office here. An internal briefing will be organized. Are you secure?" Monroe's crushing hold on her arm sprang to mind. "For the time being. They're frightened, though. They may target me once more." He gave her a shoulder pat. "Agents in ordinary clothing will be on hand to step in if needed. Simply remain hidden until we get everything arranged. After that, we move in." Amara's heart pounded with equal parts eagerness and relief. She had been preparing for this moment as an undercover agent and a justice campaigner, and it was almost here. Fear and silence had been the lifeblood of corrupt cops such as Monroe and Pierce. But in a way they didn't anticipate, she was going to end that hush. Amara made her final appearance as the silent observer in courtroom 12B. The court was scheduled to make a decision regarding Tyrone's case the following day over the admissibility of the new evidence. The air crackled with tension like static. Sensing that a larger story was developing, journalists had started to fill the seats. Community members and local activists showed up to support Tyrone. Wearing suits rather than their uniforms, Monroe and Pierce sat rigidly, as though they were attempting to project an image of good citizens. As he prepared counterarguments, the prosecutor paced and flipped through legal pads. Amara could see the quiet resolve in Lattimore's eyes, but he seemed serene. The judge made his decision after the proceedings started. The additional evidence would be admitted to a large extent. There was a rumble of excitement in the gallery. Supporters of Tyrone exchanged hopeful glances. Pierce and Monroe got white. The prosecutor sprang to his feet, claiming that the decision was biased, but the judge refused to back down. In order to give Lattimore time to thoroughly incorporate the accepted evidence into his case, he scheduled the trial for the next week. The throng filed out as the session came to an end, humming with anticipation for the trial. The reporters circled with microphones, but Monroe and Pierce stayed close to the front. Their eyes were so filled with fear that Amara could almost see it. They were dangerous, desperate animals that were confined. She went out onto the courthouse steps into the dazzling sunlight. In her pocket, her phone began to vibrate. Robert Park texted, "Everything is ready. Tomorrow, we strike. Prepare yourself." She took a deep breath of the cool Chicago air, using the sun's warmth to comfort her. Everything would be different tomorrow. Everything was ready for the big reveal. Monroe and Pierce thought they might still be able to escape. They had no idea that the very person they had written off as a harmless black child was about to bring the whole weight of the federal court system down on them. The courthouse was packed with reporters, activists, and interested bystanders the following day. There had been rumors of a big announcement that would completely change the course of Tyrone Billup's case. There were also police officers there, pacing about anxiously. The judge sat down in courtroom 12B and scowled at the unexpected crowd. Tyrone and Lattimore showed up, both of them looking determined but nervous. With their eyes darting around, obviously on high alert, Monroe and Pierce entered. Then the time arrived. An official from the United States. The Northern District of Illinois' Attorney's Office came forward and asked to speak in court. Though confused, the court granted it. When the representative revealed that fresh evidence had been presented, the room fell silent. Tyrone's case was affected by evidence that also linked officers Monroe and Pierce to a wider scheme of intimidation and wrongdoing. Then the official faced the gallery. "I would like to present Assistant U.S. Attorney Amara Davis, who has been conducting undercover investigations to obtain this evidence, if the court so desires." The courtroom was filled with a collective gasp. Reporters leaned forward as cameras flashed. Pierce and Monroe looked at each other frantically. With all eyes on her, Amara got up from the back row. The timidity had vanished. Her shoulders were square, her chin high, and she walked with measured strides down the middle aisle to the bench. She produced her official identification from her luggage and showed it to the judge. The judge examined the credentials with pinched brows. "Miss Davis?" Her voice was clear as she nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. In order to look into claims of police corruption and misbehavior involving Officers Monroe and Pierce, I have been working covertly as a court observer. Numerous counts of perjury, witness intimidation, and civil rights violations are confirmed by my substantial evidence, which includes internal documents and audio recordings." Whispers, shouts, and the quick clicks of camera shutters erupted across the courtroom. Their lawyer was astonished, and Monroe and Pierce appeared to be in disbelief. With a thud of his gavel, the judge proclaimed order. Monroe met Amara's gaze and gazed at her with shock and incredulity. She briefly remembered how he had called her love, made fun of her, and advised her to find a more suitable pastime. As she readied herself to present the case in its entirety and deliver a devastating blow of justice, she allowed that recollection to strengthen her determination. Amara, who was now officially introduced as an associate U.S. attorney, spoke to the court with the judge's approval. She methodically presented the audio recordings of her research. She aired clips from Monroe and Pierce's terrifying warnings in the parking garage, where they told her to avoid it or else there will be repercussions. Proof that has been documented. She demonstrated the inconsistencies in official police reports, the selective editing or loss of body cam footage, and the same harassment and drug planting patterns reported by several complainants in various communities. Observe intimidation. She included quotes from those who said they were intimidated by Monroe and Pierce to keep them from testifying. One internal officer who tried to denounce them but was suppressed was among those who testified. The courtroom audience listened anxiously as each piece of evidence fell like a hammer strike. Lattimore looked on in wonder. Seated next to him, Tyrone appeared on the verge of tears. Fumbling for objections, the prosecutor, who had been Monroe and Pierce's attorney, found himself overpowered. Timestamps, forensic reports, and digital information were used to confirm the legitimacy of the evidence in response to any attempts to contest its authenticity. Trapped in their own horror, Monroe and Pierce watched. When Amara revealed that she had given copies of each file to several agencies to make sure there would be no cover-ups or unexpected loss of evidence, their faces went pale. The room was completely quiet by the time she finished. The judge cleared his throat, looking pale and clearly scared. "I am directing Officers Alan Monroe and Jeremy Pierce to be placed under immediate detention, awaiting more investigation and formal charges due to the seriousness of these claims. We will postpone Mr. Billup's trial until we can ascertain how this material will affect his case." From the gallery came a roar. Reporters asked questions. Onlookers applauded. Monroe and Pierce were placed in handcuffs by court personnel. Now, no one was listening to their protests. Amara took a step back and took a deep breath as the courtroom was filled with activity. Now she was facing the full power of the storm she had called forth. Systemic corruption was struck a devastating blow by her, and the effects would be seen not only within the Chicago Police Department but also outside of it. Journalists, activists, and interested bystanders surrounded Amara in the tumultuous aftermath. In her succinct remarks, she emphasized the need of impartial law enforcement and the necessity of ongoing watchfulness against corruption. As the throng roared for more information, federal marshals then escorted her away for her own protection. The press had a field day over the next few days. The story of the undercover U.S. attorney who revealed corrupt police officers made headlines in the Chicago Tribune and Chicago Sun-Times, and it quickly spread across the country, sparking a national dialogue about institutional racism and police accountability. A number of felonies, including conspiracy, perjury, and civil rights violations, were officially brought against Monroe and Pierce. Internal Affairs found a network of illegal operations that implicated several other policemen in the 9th Precinct, and their bail was set at an unreasonably high amount. A number of suspensions and terminations resulted from the expansion of investigations. The DA's office issued a rare public apology after Tyrone Billup's charges were dropped. With tears of relief running down his cheeks, he left jail as a free man. Later on, he would sue the city in civil court, perhaps winning a sizable payout. The victory was sad but significant for Amara. Although she had accomplished her goal, she was aware that more needed to be done. The system as a whole wouldn't be fixed by one case. Nevertheless, it was a moment of complete validation to see Monroe and Pierce's smirks erased from their faces as they were brought away in handcuffs. Amara met with her supervisors in a private conference room in the U.S. Attorney's office to debrief. Robert Park shook her hand firmly and handed her a letter of praise. "Well done," he said. "You defended the moral high ground." Thinking back on the turbulent weeks she'd been undercover, she nodded. She responded, "I hope this sends a message that no one is above the law." Stories of Monroe and Pierce terrorizing the local black community for years without repercussions surfaced in the days that followed. People Amara had never met came forward to express their satisfaction that the prejudice and intimidation they had experienced had finally been revealed. Karma had so dealt its blow. It was a harsh but well-earned retribution for the haughty cops who had made fun of a shy black girl in court. Their reputations were ruined, and their power was broken. They waited in a small holding cell for trial. The face of the exact lady they had undervalued was worn by justice when it arrived. Let's continue the discussion if this narrative has stoked your desire for justice or if you just like the surprises. Corruption exists, but so does the strength of resolute people standing up for what's right. Amara demonstrated to us that no one is too little, too quiet, or too underappreciated to have a significant influence. People can step forward to demand accountability and bring light where darkness reigns when systems fail. I encourage you to enjoy this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel if you think that tales like these might spur genuine change. Your assistance makes important news and conversations more widely known. Let's keep exposing injustice and promoting openness. Every click, share, and subscription together adds a voice to the chorus calling for a more just and equal world. I appreciate you watching.